Happy New Year. This is Karen. And today we want to look ahead to our new year of data collection, to year 2 of data collection for EvalFest. And we're going to try to do that in a couple of different ways. Sorry, there we go. Before I get into that, Emma, I did not start the recording. I don't know if you want to record this or not. Oh, it is being recorded. Never mind. So the roadmap for today is to share the plans for the 2016 data collection and to start thinking together beyond that as well. We want to do that by reviewing the final list of core questions for 2016. We want to share some new analysis that we've done to inform that final list. And then we have time at the end to invite everybody to start thinking about and discussing impact. And that will be a topic that we probably revisit over and over again this year. And then we'll probably have a pretty significant influence on how we spend our time together at the annual meeting in June and the work that we do in the years to come. So that's where we're going today. I'm going to give some shout outs first. And we really think that everybody deserves a shout out this time. So as you know, in December, we stalked you pretty heavily to try to get the research data that we needed. And we are thrilled to report that all of the research data are in. You guys totally stepped up to the plate. You gave us exactly what we needed in the 3 different instruments that we were trying to use to collect year 1 outcomes related to evaluation use and capacity building. We will be analyzing those data in the next month and hope to report those out to the group. I think it's probably right now the plan is as part of the March webinar, but those plans are still in motion a little bit. And we wanted to give a special thank you and shout out to the 16 festivals that will be happening between now and July, because each of you did a tremendous amount of work to think critically about the survey items that you used last year and reflect on which of those you want to have again this year. We did an hour-long interview with each of those 16 sites, and those I thought were really fantastic conversations, and I think we all really appreciated the level of effort that went into those and the way that you guys all challenged our thinking about what we're up to as part of this project. That has resulted in a few changes that you'll hear about in a few minutes. For now, we just wanted to do a quick review with everybody of the final list of core items that we have for 2016. And I am going to attempt to turn this over to Emma and let her drive for a few minutes. And then we'll join you guys later for the rest of the presentation. All right, Emma, I think you are up. If you are up, though, we can't hear you, so you might still be muted.
There we go. All right, so can everybody hear me? Great.
I can, yeah.
Awesome. So we were going to be, oops, I have this on the wrong slide, I think. Actually, no, I don't. Great. So for this year's core questions, for all of our field researchers, before we approach an attendee, we want them to be able to put into the iPad on QuickTap first who's entering the data so that we are aware of whether or not the data is going to be entered by a festival attendee. Like for instance, if you're going to be handing the iPad over to the attendee to fill it out, or if you are filling out these surveys after the fact, if you filled out paper surveys and sent them to, and people had them returned to you, and then you had your field researchers input that data into QuickTap, like we know some of you did. That's something we want to know. The festival name, again, it helps us set up the skip patterns to choose your festival, and then any event name for your specific event, that is data that specifically will help you out. So make sure that you put that information in if that is information that you want to know.
Hey, Emma and Karen, we're not seeing Emma's screen right now.
Oh, sorry. Guys, because I had it paused for some reason. I am so sorry about that.
It's okay.
And it should show now.
All right, I think that's it.
There we go. So sorry about that. So again, for your field researchers, before we approach an attendee, they should be putting in data about who is entering the data, if it's going to be given to an attendee, or if they're entering this data after the fact, festival name, and then your event names to help you evaluate your own data. So the first two questions on our core items are going to be to help set out our skip patterns. How long have you been at today's event? We found in our research with Amy that people who had been at the events less than 30 minutes really didn't have good input and they weren't able to appropriately evaluate the event. So we are going to have people who check the less than 30 minutes go straight to the demographics data. That way we still collect all of that information. But if they were at the event for less than 30 minutes, they're not going to get any of your other more specific information just because it's not valuable. And then for how old are you, this is going to be used to set up information for later on in the survey. If you have child questions, this will help us send things to children questions. One of our core questions will only be answered by people who are over the age of 18 because we found that children just weren't effective in answering it and were very confused by it. So that is going to help out. And it also helps us collect additional demographics data on who is filling out these surveys. So within the survey, we're going to have two different text displays. If you have children in your group, they will be asked, a lot of people we found when they were filling out the surveys, if they had children, they would sometimes fill it out for their children, and that's not what we want. We obviously want them to fill out things based on their experiences. So when people get to the main questions, they will have this text box. If you have any children in your group, please respond to these questions based on your own personal experience, not the children's experience. And that's just a way to make sure that it's clear to whoever is filling it out that they know what you're doing. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. And then again, we are going to ask the following items, ask you about STEM, which stands for science, technology, engineering, and or math, just to clarify what STEM is to our attendees. So these are our outcome questions. They're just a little slightly different from last year. We're trying to ask the same thing, but we found in our think alouds that the wording we had used before wasn't the best. So we've just changed it to, at today's event, I learned something new. And at today's event, I felt inspired by something I did in STEM. The question, did today's event make you more aware of how STEM is a part of your life, will only be asked to attendees who are over the age of 18. Children just did not understand that question at all in our Think Alouds data, so we're just not going to be asking it to kids. So these are going to be processing items. We have several festivals that don't, sorry. So in these items, we had some issues with STEM professional, as I'm sure that you are all aware from our, from last year's annual meeting. So in our Think Aloud data, we found that STEM professional just wasn't working at it, confused people, especially children, and it was hard to think of people who were STEM professionals. You can't really think of that off the top of your head. So we've changed the wording to be, in the past year, I interacted with someone who works with science or engineering, and at today's event, I interacted with someone who works with science or engineering. This will really help out with clarification in the survey and just helping people understand that while they may or may not have interacted with a STEM professional, they don't think. They definitely interacted with somebody who works with science or engineering. Our feedback item is the same as last year. For our ratings, how would you rate today's event overall? Poor, fair, good, very good, excellent. We had good feedback on that one. Demographics. We are again asking gender as an open question. And we are asking all of the same demographic wording and zip code for our which groups do you identify, and then collecting zip code data. We did talk about changing the gender item back to multiple choice, and we were asked to think about some of these graphics and we were asked to think about these graphics for QuickTap to see if that would work. And with that, I'm going to switch it over to Catherine because she has some feedback about that. So I am just going to make sure Catherine is unmuted.
I think I am. Hello?
There you are. Hi, Catherine. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I definitely was one who was like, oh my gosh, it would be so much simpler if we could just ask, check a box for male or female, or perhaps adding a third category of, whoops, not there yet, if you can go back a slide, prefer to not disclose. But I'd started doing some research, or not really research, but just looking around a lot on the web, and found that there's really not a consensus yet on how to ask this question in a way that feels right to everyone in our country. So what the consistent answers that I saw, the most consistent suggestions were, the first thing was a lot of people suggested that you just don't ask gender at all on surveys unless you really need to. I don't know that we really need to, but I do know that we all are very interested in this, and it's information that's useful for us. So we'll still be asking it. The second most consistent response was that if you are asking it, the best way to do it is to ask it in an open-ended way. I mean, the best way being the most accepting, or yeah. So we'll continue to do it as open-ended. I know it creates more work for all of us in terms of categorizing people's responses, but that seems to be the way to do it for now, and to be accepting of all. The other part was that in our phone conversations with all of our spring festivals, several of you suggested maybe asking all of the demographic questions, or a few of you, at the very beginning or very near the beginning of the survey. Obviously, the gender, race, ethnicity, and zip code are data that's very useful for all of our festivals, and it's something that so some sites suggested putting it at the beginning so that we could ensure that we have this data from people. First, I'll remind people that if an attendee has been at the festival for less than 30 minutes, they will still get these questions. So they'll just get the demographic questions, but not the other questions. Second, in terms of moving it up, I think that for the most part, almost all people complete all of the questions, unless they purposefully choose to skip, say, the race ethnicity question. So given that most people already go through the whole survey, especially our surveys as a whole are pretty short, and people go through it and complete it all, we felt like we could leave it lower in the survey. And the other idea behind keeping it further down in the survey is, and I think this is just a thought, and some people might see it as a little bit of a stretch, but the group of us had some concerns about whether it would feel unwelcoming to some people to be asked their gender and race ethnicity right at the beginning of the survey. I know that so just the thought that this might make people feel less welcome at an event, and we really don't want our attendees at all of our expos to feel that it's not a place for them. And again, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but this idea is partly based in a research called stereotype threat, and it's one of the most widely studied topics in social psychology. And that certainly hasn't been studied at science festivals. So again, I'm not sure how much of a fit it is here, but stereotype threat occurs when a person feels that they are at risk of confirming negative stereotypes about their social group. So for example, when people are asked their gender at the beginning of a math test, women perform lower than when they're not asked gender on the test or when it's asked at the end of the test. So given that STEM is still in a lot of ways regarded as a white male field, and these are STEM events, it is possible that asking this question early on could be off-putting to some people. I'm just to be clear, that's just a possible connection, but given that and given that people do complete this data, we're going to leave it further in on the surveys. So, happy to share any of the resources that I found about gender questions, as well as more information about stereotype threat, if folks are interested. Turning it back to, I think it's Karen.
Yes, it should be me. Let's see if I can actually get this to do what I want. All right, is everybody seeing a slide that says, wait a minute?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, yay. So if you are following along very closely at home and comparing the items that we just presented to those that you got back in December, you might be thinking, hang on, there are a couple of things that seem to have fallen off of the page. And that is true. So one of the really interesting things that happened, and luckily it happened quite early on in the interviews that we did this month, was that Tatiana and Chelsea from the Texas A&M team actually raised some interesting ideas about the questions that you see on the screen now. And Tatiana's idea about the first item is that, look, you know, I'm running an expo event. Expos are designed to be fun. So if the expo is fun, and we know it is, then this question about having fun is probably the exact same thing as the overall rating that they give on the poor to excellent scale. And so she was questioning whether we really need to be asking this twice, or whether we are, you know, maybe wasting some of our valuable survey space by including both of these and requiring them of everybody as core questions. The second point that she raised had to do with these items about awareness of STEM jobs. And she said, you know, as part of this community, I know that there are a lot of us that have this as a key piece of the mission. It's what we're trying to accomplish. But for us, it's not. And so if there's a way for us to lift these off, that would also be really exciting. It was lucky for us that Texas A&M was one of the first interviews that we did, because we thought, all right, you know, these are actually really good points. Let's take it to everybody else we're going to talk to and see what they have to say, and get sort of a range of reactions to these different ideas. And so if we look here, this is sort of Tatiana's idea, right? That these are redundant items. The measure of how much fun they had learning STEM is going to be the same thing as that overall rating. When we talked to people, we said, well, we had some people that said, well, yes and no. So yeah, fun is part of it, but there are all these logistics that happen in a festival that also really impact how somebody feels about that event overall. So for these folks, it was fun, but then also some of the logistical stuff that ends up culminating in the overall rating. And so we had one group of people that said, you know, I can see where Tatiana is going with that, but I think that these are different enough that I would still want to have both of them. And then we had another group that thought it's actually probably a combination of several of our outcome items that converge into that overall rating. So we had plenty of different perspectives that led us to think maybe it was going to be okay to consider dropping this item. And then we thought, hey, we've got some data. Maybe we should look at it and see what the data have to say. And so we went back and did some additional analysis with the data that we have from last year to see what those data had to say about the decision we might make in response to this question and the careers question as well. So one of the things that we also learned in the interviews is that we've started asking people what kinds of additional support they would like to have from the leadership team. And one of the consistent messages there is some additional support around analysis. And we're going to try to provide that in several different ways this year. We're going to take a baby step in that direction today just by talking with a slightly higher level of detail about the kinds of analysis that we're doing. So what you see here is one idea that people shared about the commonality of all of these things. That if you are somebody who is going to give this event an excellent rating, so you're up in that top right-hand corner, that this was an excellent event, I'm giving this thing a 5, then you are probably also somebody who had a lot of fun at the event, who learned a lot, who felt inspired, who was completely stoked to learn all the ways that STEM surrounds you every day, who picked up some new fun facts about STEM jobs, and all of that combines into this rating. Or if you rate one of these things high, you rate all of the other things high. And there's an analysis that you can do that helps test that idea. And it's sort of the baby step that people often take if they're thinking about combining across items and using sort of a scale score instead of looking at individual ratings. It's called a Cronbach's Alpha. And it basically looks to see how consistently people pick ratings across the items that they're given. So if you give a high score on one of these, are you likely to give a high score on all of the other as well? And it turns out that in our case, the answer to that was yes. So typically with this statistic, you get a number between 0 and 1. Anything above a 0.7 is considered a decent level of consistency across the items that are rated. We're at a 0.87, so we're well above that. So there is a lot of consistency in the way that people are rating these different items that we're looking at. The other thing that we looked at, and this is really more specific to the point that Tatiana was raising, is really just these 2 items. So Tatiana was asking about these 2 in particular. And if you just want to look how 2 individual things relate to each other, then that's just a straight correlation. And so we did the correlation for all of the items and that overall rating. And it turned out this item about having fun learning with STEM does have the highest statistic associated with the overall rating. So of all the possible dyads on this list and that overall rating, these 2 are the strongest. And so there is some evidence in the data that we have that we probably don't have to require this as a core item, this fun item for every single person. So we were leaning in that direction. And then we talked to the Atlanta team, and Melton raised what we thought was also a fantastic point about the fact that, yes, expo events are designed to be fun, but not all festival events are. And in some cases, and I think the example that she gave was a lecture series or a panel where you're having people talk about cancer research, it may not feel appropriate to ask people if they had fun at that event. Yes, you hope that they enjoyed the event and that it met their expectations, but there are some instances where asking about having fun with STEM isn't quite the right fit. And what we're hoping this year is that now that we've got some data behind us, mostly data collected in expos, that we will start to see people take this survey and use it in other festival contexts, or maybe even beyond festival contexts, if it makes sense to do that, so that we're gathering more data and in a greater variety of contexts than what we achieved in the first year. So we wanted to think about the generalizability of the instrument, and we think it's more generalizable if this item is not considered core. So we're going to allow people to lift this one off for this year. It's no longer going to be a core item, but we do have the Think Aloud data behind it, and so we know the item works. If it does still feel like it's pulling unique information for you, then we absolutely want you to use it. It'll still be made available to you. If we look at that decision in relation to the data that we have from the first year of data collection for EvalFest, This is a chart that you've seen before. These numbers have been updated to show all year one data. And so you can see that fun continues to be the top rated item, followed by that overall rating. So the 4.24 that you see off to the side there is the poor to excellent scale. So we are clearly gathering data at festival events that are successful. We're in that very good to excellent range on average. And then learning is the next item down on the list. So for this year, some people will choose to continue asking fun and others won't, but we're going to focus more on learning down through awareness and then that overall rating as the core items. I also wanted to use this slide to transition to talking about careers. So when we talked to the 16 of us that will have our festival between now and July, it turned out that half of those festivals do have a core piece of their mission that's tied to increasing awareness of STEM careers, and the other half don't. And we want to make sure that we're not getting into the habit of asking evaluation questions that are not tied directly to the goals of the event, because as a community, it makes us less successful than we probably are to be looking at data in context where it was not an intended outcome. But we also don't want to get in the habit of burdening ourselves, our field researchers, or our participants by asking items that just aren't relevant. So we really like the career items. We think they will function even better this coming year than they did last year. But we want people to have the option to ask that only in context where it makes sense and to leave them off in context where it does not. We do have some data to look at in relation to these decisions as well, and these I'm kind of excited about because I think they move us in the direction of a recommendation. This next slide, though, does not look very pretty, so brace yourselves for a second, but hang on because there's more to come. So we went back to the data from last year, and we said, all right, we've got data from 16, 17 festivals where we know either they had career awareness and increased STEM job awareness as a central piece of their mission, or they didn't. And we went back and split the data that we have from last year into one of those two groups, and then ran a t-test to see if there was a difference between people who had this as central to their mission and how people rated the career item in those instances compared to those who didn't have it. And the data are actually the opposite of what we would expect. So we have stronger outcome ratings for people who attended festivals that did not have that as a core piece of their mission compared to groups that did. Now that doesn't make sense. The numbers are not that far off, but it is considered statistically significant. So that could be a little bit puzzling. But then we have this other thing to consider as well, and that is the name tags. So the name tags that people use are something that we've talked about on the leadership team on and off all year, because we're really interested in whether and how using these name tags and explicitly labeling your scientists makes a difference at the festival. And it turns out that in this case, it does. And this is kind of cool, I think. So we went back to the data again, and we said, all right, well, half of these, or a certain number of these festivals that have this career mission label their scientists, and the others don't. And what do the data look like? If we look at this exact same item based on who had it as their mission and labeled their scientists, you see what's actually a pretty big difference between the outcome ratings that people report and how much they gained in awareness of STEM careers in the instances where they were labeled versus instances where they weren't. And that, I think, is pretty cool, because it starts to move us toward what feels like a recommendation, right? If this is important to you, if this is something you're striving for at your festival, doing something as simple as printing up labels that say, hi, my name is blank and I'm a blank, could make a really big difference. And so if you didn't do this last year, I think it might be interesting to decide whether you want to devote the resources to that for 2016, and then to compare the results that you get across those 2 years to see if you're noticing a big jump the way that we seem to see in the data that we have from last year. All right. We do also want to think about labeling scientists in relation to the questions that ask directly about STEM professionals. And so we went back and looked at these data from last year in relation to this as well. So if you labeled your scientists in 2015, 80% of your attendees believed that they interacted with a STEM professional. If you didn't, 77% believed that they interacted with a STEM professional. Our sample size is big enough that this is actually a statistically significant difference. So the labels do matter, and they particularly matter. I think that the results are actually more interesting from the previous slide, where you're really trying to get people to think about interacting with those people and learning from them about the varied types of careers. But these are what the numbers look like for this year if you look at that split across those who labeled and who didn't for the entire data set from last year. All right, and here's why this matters. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but we did update this slide for you as well. So if this is a slide that you have found handy in showing the fact that interacting with a STEM professional or someone who works in science and engineering matters to how people rate festival events, these are the final numbers from last year. So the folks in orange are people who believe they interacted with a STEM professional. The folks in blue are those who don't think they had that experience. And there is a statistically significant difference across the board in those two groups and the ratings that they provide to describe the outcomes and the satisfaction with the events. Okay. We want to start to shift gears and think about what we might do that will be different this year. It could be the answer for you is nothing. You might do the attendee and stick with QuickTap, and those are really the data you want, and that's where you want to keep things, and that is perfectly fine. What we're hoping is that over the next few years, some of us will choose to branch out in new and interesting and different ways. The easiest way to think about doing that for this year is something that I already mentioned, and that is taking this survey and if you've got the opportunity, using it in a context, a festival context beyond the expo. So the event characteristic analysis that we eventually will be able to do on the dashboard is going to be much more powerful if we have a wider range of data than we had from last year. So we're hoping that if your festival does include events beyond the expo, that sometime, maybe this year, maybe 2-3 years down the road, you'll think about whether it makes sense to take that same instrument and use it in different contexts and have all of that data live in the dashboard so that we can all explore it across the variability that can happen in any of these contexts. The other way that you might think about expanding beyond the core questions and the QuickTap survey this year is to go back to the engagement survey. So we learned a couple of important things last year based on the engagement survey and that Think Aloud work that Amy did. So one thing that we learned is that this scale, this yes, yes, no, no scale works for kids and it works for grown-ups. There was some question about this scale not really being appropriate for grown-ups. Evaluators in particular really don't like this scale, but it works. When you do the Think Alouds, people understand it and they like it and they're fine with it. So we know that we can use this to ask adults at our festivals to rate their engagement and that it also works for kids. That said, it does not work if you use this scale to ask people to talk about their festival event over their experience for the day overall. It needs to be tied to a particular booth or a particular activity that they have just experienced. And the reason for that is because items like being focused on things they were learning the whole time or being busy doing other tasks, doing stuff not related to what we were learning, those don't make sense in the context of a day-long experience where you float from booth to booth and you have lunch and you wander around. And so we really need to be a little bit more focused on a particular activity if we want to ask people to reflect on their festival experiences through this particular survey. We do think that there's a way to do that, and we're gonna play around with this using one method in North Carolina this year. Based on the interviews that we did over the last couple of weeks, there are a handful of other people who are going to play around with getting some of this data this year, and we want to encourage the rest of you to think about that as well, if it makes sense. For a lot of people, it's not going to make sense, and that is totally fine. Here's what it might look like, though, either for this year or a future year. For this year, this is actually last year's Expo map from the UNC Expo. What we would need to do is come up with a sampling plan for how to get these data in a meaningful way. And we think that these data have some value to the EvalFest community, particularly if they're collected in relation to the kind of booth that's being rated, so that we can start to get an idea of whether people are feeling more engaged by demonstration booths than hands-on booths, or by tours than lectures, and start to compare across the different kinds of experiences that are typically offered at a festival. So if we wanted to do this year in North Carolina, we're first going to decide what we don't have to pay attention to on this map. So we know we don't have to gather data about the food trucks. Those are pretty good. And let's say from past experience, we know that we don't really need data from these particular booths either, because they're not going to have a hands-on or a demonstration. Then we would think about, all right, how many field researchers do we need, and then assign each of them a different starting place. So the idea that I'm playing around with this year for our festival is that everybody will be assigned to a cluster of booths. And they will start by picking one of those booths and going to hang out sort of around the fringes and figuring out what kind of booth that is. Is it a lecture-only booth? Is it hands-on? Is it demonstration? And making note of that in QuickTap. They'll then use the same process we've all been using, where they wait for the 5th person to leave that booth, and that's the person they approach, and they ask them to complete the engagement survey and provide us some demographic information. Once they're done with that particular booth, I think it's probably going to make sense for people to sort of float around from cluster to cluster in sort of a circular pattern, so that we're not making the people running the booth feel self-conscious about the fact that there's somebody loitering with a t-shirt on that looks very official right outside what they're trying to do, but we've got sort of a constant flow of evaluators moving from cluster to cluster. And the possibility for people to cycle around multiple times and pick a different booth each time. So I think this is what we're going to try this year for our expo here. With the idea that we really want to start learning about what people do find the most engaging. How do people rate the performances? How do they rate lab tours? How do they rate the Discovery Bus tours? How do they rate hands-on and demonstrations? And what looks the same and what looks different from an engagement perspective? So that's one idea that people might play with. We should be able to provide some feedback on how this went about midway through the year. So if you're a fall festival, there may be a handful of us that can help you make some informed decisions about whether you want to use this method or a different method as you move into your data collection for 2016. The other thing that I'm sort of excited about is this motivations for doing science and really motivation for doing public outreach. If you have been part of the festival community since the first IPSEC meeting, you'll know that even as far back as 2010, 2011, people were really interested in figuring out why scientists participate in festivals and what they get out of it. And we've not really tackled that in a systematic way, but I think this survey can help us begin to do that. This is one of the DeVise scales. So it was actually originally developed for citizen science, and it was originally developed to look at motivations for engaging in science activities. But as part of their validation work, they have come up with a customized version of this survey where you can ask about other kinds of activities. So I'm intrigued by the idea of asking, and actually Jonathan Frederick gets credit for this because we were talking about it and he was like, wouldn't it be cool if we could use this for scientists? And the customized version and using it in that way had not occurred to me, and suddenly I was like, oh my gosh, we can do that. DeVise has given us what we need. And so I think we can ask about public outreach activities and why scientists do public outreach activities. This scale has 8 items. It breaks down into an internal motivation versus an external motivation score. And so we can think about whether people are participating in our festivals, whether scientists are participating in our festivals because it's part of their own professional passion and or because of external forces that come to play and that impact why they make the decisions that they do. So we are going to use this. What you're seeing now is something that's already in SurveyMonkey. We're going to pull together a survey that we hope to use with all of our expo scientists this year. And for anybody who's interested, I can actually zap this survey directly from my account to your SurveyMonkey account. All you need to do is send me an email and let me know that you want it. I'll zap it to you. You won't have to program anything unless you decide you want to change some of the other items or add some extra pages. And then we'll ask you to share the data back with us so that we can start to grow a database related to these kinds of data as well. We're going to shift gears for the rest of the conversation. Before I do that, why don't I stop for a second and just see if we have any questions about what we've talked about and what's been presented so far. Emma and I are going to tag team things from this point, so if you want to raise your hand if you have a comment. Emma, there may also be some questions to look at in the question section, and then Denise and Catherine are here to help answer those as well. Emma, I'm not sure if you're talking, but if you are, you are muted again.
All right, I am talking, and I saw that Gina has raised her hand, so Gina, I'm going to unmute you. Can you hear me, Gina?
So, yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Gina?
Okay. So I like this motivations for doing science. I wonder if we want a little bit of information about the scientists themselves. So, like, is it somebody who, in our festival, it could be a paramedic who, you know, is not a PhD level scientist kind of person, or it could be someone who's a PhD level scientist who works at a university. And so I think we get additional information out of this motivation survey if we also had some information about the respondent.
Uh-huh. Perfect. Yep, I'm making a note.
Let's see. Jerry wanted to know if this was just for scientists or for any expo exhibitors.
So you could do it for any, I think. We are assuming that our expo presenters are scientists, but I think along with Gina's suggestion about gathering some key information about what kind of scientist that person is, it may be that they're not somebody who identifies as a scientist at all, particularly for, that would definitely be true for festivals that don't require that or aren't even interested in having their booth presenters be scientists who are interacting with the public directly.
All right, I see that Adam raised his hand, so Adam, I'm going to unmute you. Can we hear you?
Hi there. I had a question specifically about the new data collection, the method, and I was just curious, so as a statewide festival, we collected data at a couple different sites, and are you encouraging us to only use one of the methods across all sites, or could we do different methods at different locations?
I think you can do different methods at different locations. I'm okay with that. That's actually what we're doing here. So and I'm glad you asked it in that way, Adam, because I think I should probably circle back and say that it's still the expectation of the project that everyone will use QuickTap to collect data from at least one expo. Beyond that, anything you choose to do is up to you and the evaluation needs and interests of your festival team. So if you want to do the engagement survey, you can't take the engagement survey and do it instead of the core items because we need the core items as sort of the basis of the grant. But if you wanted to play around with the engagement survey at just one of your other large events, Adam, then you could certainly do that. You don't have to make a blanket decision across all of the different events, as long as you meet that basic requirement of gathering attendee data from one expo. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Karen had a question about skip logic that I think we can answer privately. Jordan asks if there are any findings so far from the motivations from doing science outreach scale, or has it not been used?
So this scale has not been used in festival context as far as I know. It has been used, the validation work for it was done within the context of citizen science. And so, and it's been pretty heavily tested in that context. The customized version, I can ask Tina. Tina Phillips is one of the advisors for EvalFest, and she's the lead on the team, the devise team at Cornell that's been doing all of this work. I don't know if their vision for these customized versions was still related to citizen science, or if they think this is just as valid an interpretation or an application of their instrument. I'm excited to see what it gives us. I was just reviewing a bunch of instruments related to public engagement with science events, and this, and just as we have done with our festivals, when we look at other kinds of public engagement events, most of that evaluation has focused on attendees as well. And so we don't really have a lot of strong examples in the literature, particularly something that has the potential to be a validated scale that we could think about applying. And that's why we think this is our best shot to sort of hit the ground running with something that does have some validity behind it and see whether and how it works with festivals.
And there's another question from Karen. She mentioned that she had an she had an issue with the child surveys that we've had in the past with that we talked about actually with some of our spring festivals, where we don't have the ages of the adults who the children then hand the surveys to after that. So wanted to know if we were doing anything to fix that in the survey, which I know that we are working on. And some of the and she also mentioned that some of the demographic questions don't make sense for kids aged 10 to 18. Karen, are you able to be on the phone, or can you clarify a little bit? Let me see. Karen, I've unmuted you. Can you hear me? Yep,
I'm going to go ahead and attempt to answer what I think I can while we're trying to get audio.
I thought we heard her.
I thought I did too.
Yeah. Go ahead. Karen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's the other Karen.
Other Karen. Where is she? Yeah, I don't have you. I can't find you, Karen. I'm so sorry. Where are you? There you go. All right, found you. Thank you.
I can see I'm unmuted. Well, we had particularly problems with that question about how much money are you planning on spending, or how much money have you already spent. If somebody is 10 years old, that really didn't make that much sense. We finally we went into this and we had to tell our evaluators, well, just ask them about what they personally spend, even if they're 10 years old, if they have pocket money. But, you know, is there any way that we can just, because that raised a lot of questions from festival visitors and evaluators. It's like, you know, I mean, they're 10, they're 12, they're 13, 14. They don't really have any money to spend, so why are we asking that? And we had agreed that we were not going to ask the kids to ask their parents for for help in answering these questions. So my concern is that we got some data that might be biased. And since we're using these data, particularly on how much money do you spend or how much money have you already spent, in order to attract vendors, I really need to have a clean, clean data where I can point towards numbers.
Yeah.
That was one of them, and I've just, yeah.
Yeah, so two things. First of all, you should be, if you use, do you use SPSS to analyze your data, Karen, or what do you use?
Well, I use SPSS, but I'm having some problems here too because QuickTap doesn't have SPSS, so I basically have to download Excel and then pull it in.
Yeah.
And we already talked about this, but we had those 11 people who were not in St. Pete but in Arizona. For those we don't have how long they've been at the Science Festival out of some weird reason, so I had to delete them. So I really, cleaning up that data set has been taking a long time, because before I can pull it into SPSS. And that was another question. QuickTap, there's no possibility to get SPSS?
No.
Only Excel?
Okay. We sent them a wish list several months ago for things that SPSS was not on the list because that's a really big ask, I think. But we did send them a wish list of things from both the survey programming side but also the analytics side. And the way that data are downloaded and the difficulty that comes with the options that are currently available was part of that. So SPSS, though, Karen, will let you go in and it should be pretty easy to create a new variable in SPSS that isolates just people 18 and over and lets you look at that spending item. And so if you want some extra help with that, then just let us know. The other thing that you're mentioning is something that we do want to try to be a little bit smarter about this year. There are probably a number of items, like the education level item for people who are using that it doesn't make sense to ask of people below a certain age range. And so now that we have the age question at the very beginning, we should be able to use that to set the skip patterns for later items. We also have instances, if people are using the kid questions, one of the things that we're going to ask you to do is ask the age question a second time so that you get it up front from the kids and you get it later in the survey from the adults. So you'll remember that if you go to the kid questions, the kid is instructed to hand the iPad to their grown-up at a certain point. We want to make sure that when that happens, we pick up the age of that person as well.
Okay, that would help.
Yeah, and we're going to need some help though so we're using the same system this year that we used last year. We met with each of the teams individually. Emma and I are currently doing the programming for the first half of the festival season, and all of that should be done by the end of the month. And people should, in the next few days, start getting the all clear to go in and field test and sort of pilot test and quick tap their survey for this year. And the skip patterns are going to be a big thing that we try to focus on this year to make sure that all of those, that you guys are testing all of those out and that we've made the smartest skip pattern choices that we can. And the examples that you've just raised, I think, are perfect examples of that.
Thank you.
Sure. We only have a few minutes left. We don't have enough time to really dive into this last question. But we did want to spend a few minutes, and I think I might ask, actually, given that time is short, for people to use the chat feature. We need to start thinking about impact. If we're going to measure impact, which is such a messy word, in informal learning especially, we need to see if there is any common ground we can find across the community in how to go about doing this. Or if there's not common ground, we need to think about what are the topical areas that we want to focus on as a community and that we care the most about. So that even if only a handful of festivals decide that they want to start to measure impact, that the rest of the community feels like they can benefit from that perspective, even though if they're not directly involved in the data collection itself. So we want to be able to talk about impact, particularly when we meet in June and then beyond that, and start making some plans for how we might measure impact in the next several years. And we are interested in how people think about this term in relation to the work that's happening. And that might be a very different answer if you're thinking about it from the perspective of attendees versus your partners or your outreach network versus your sponsors versus others, and that might include scientists, so maybe we're on the right track there. But we need some feedback and some guidance from people about longer term impact than what we're currently measuring and what you'd like to know about your festival or what your sponsors really want to know about your festival. So if you have an advisory board, what do they ask you about? If you see people talking about festivals being only a one-time occurrence and are they really doing anything? What kinds of outcomes, what kinds of longer-term impacts are they looking for to really validate this as a medium of effective informal learning and outreach? So those are huge questions. We can certainly open the lines again if people have quick comments, but I'd really appreciate it if people could start typing their own festival's definition of impact, if you have one, in the chat so that we can have a record of those on the call, even if we don't have time to talk about them. Emma, I see lots of questions. I don't know if these are in relation to the impact discussion.
I don't see any related to impact specifically.
Okay.
Karen Bronsberger says minority attendance and involvement. Jerry says to inspire a passion for science and technology for attendees. Denise says a public understanding of science. Awesome.
And all of those, if I think about those, all of those are attendee level impacts. So I don't know if Jeremy's on the line, but Jeremy has been getting pressure from at least one sponsor in relation to what they're calling the ROI. So there's this whole idea of like return on investment. What are you getting for your sponsorship dollars? But the sponsors have been pretty vague about that beyond the number of people served at a festival. The only thing that they've been able to give him, and this is something that we hear from our advisory board sometimes as well, is that they want more STEM majors and they want more people going into STEM careers. That seems like a lot to ask from a science festival, in my opinion. But if any of the rest of you get that from your advisors or your sponsors, if you could just raise your hand really quickly so we can do a quick count to see if that's a challenge that anybody else is experiencing. Yeah, so we have a few. So Renee is saying yes, Kim's saying yes, Jordan, Jonathan, John Pass, Cindy. So we have some people asking about that. Are there other things, are there other things like that, and everybody, like, let's see, if you could put your hands down. Are there other things along those lines that seem very pie in the sky, but that folks are hearing from sponsors as an expectation of what the festival should accomplish? If you have other examples like that, Jonathan has one, it looks like, or he forgot to lower his hand, one or the other. Oh yeah, his hand is down. Okay. I think those are the kinds of things that we need to think about. And maybe I'll just leave everybody with this final thought. We're over time, so I apologize about that. The original vision for how we might measure impact actually had to do with knowledge and sort of longitudinal understanding of a topic that was salient to a past festival. And we were going to use some of John Falk's work as the model for that. I'm not sure that that makes sense for the kinds of festivals that we have and the kind of work that we're doing. But this idea of impact is a challenge that we are all faced with, and I don't know that any of us is going to have a better opportunity to try to tackle this on our own than what EvalFest can provide as an opportunity for us to try to do this together. So it's something that we're going to have to try to wrap our heads around and our hands around, and so a conversation that maybe will be continued sometime in the near future. That is it for today. If you guys have any further questions, if there's something you wanted us to follow up on that we didn't have a chance to do in the hour today, please send it in an email, and we will be back in touch soon. Other than that, best of luck to Idaho and to Charleston, who hit the ground running. They start our festival season again this year in just a couple of short weeks. And again, Happy New Year to everybody, and thanks for tuning in.